All right, well, if you have your Bibles, open to the book of Exodus. And we're walking through the book of Exodus together. And last week we talked about the fact that God's people had been enslaved for 200 years in Egypt. Now, I want to explain something really quick because I just realized that maybe this is not clear to all of us. There are actually multiple terms to describe God's people in the Bible. And all these terms can be used interchangeably. All right, so sometimes God's people are referred to as the Hebrews, right? The Hebrews. And in the Old Testament, the word Hebrew actually comes from the term shepherd in the language of Hebrew. And so Abraham, this was kind of his lifestyle. He was a shepherd, and this was kind of their heritage as a family. It's kind of what they did. So they were referred to as Hebrews because the word itself is derived from shepherding. But of course, we've also heard Israelites being used to describe God's people. Now that comes from a man named Jacob, who was a descendant of Abraham. Jacob had 12 sons. Those 12 sons ended up becoming the head of the 12 tribes of God's people. But God gave Jacob a new name. He called him Israel. And so the people of Israel were, again, all of his descendants, all the descendants of his 12 sons who became the 12 tribes. So when Jacob was renamed to Israel, that's where his people began to be referred to as Israelites. And then the term Jews would probably be the third one. So Hebrews, Israelites, and Jews. Where that came from is when, Israel separated into two. There was a northern kingdom and southern kingdom, and things really started to kind of fall apart. God's judgment came, and many of them were hauled off into Babylonian captivity. And there was one final remaining tribe that hung in there, stayed faithful to God, and it was the tribe of Judah. And that's where we get the name Jews. Okay, so from that last faithful tribe to God of Judah is where the term Jews come from. So whether we call them Hebrews or Israelites or Jews, that's where those terms coming from, and that's why we can kind of use them interchangeably. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so just wanted to make that clear. So by this time, God's people had grown as their slaves in Egypt. Over this 400-year period, they grew from a group of 70 people to about 3 million people over this 400-year period. So they literally became a nation within a nation. They became a nation of their own within the boundaries of Egypt. But the Egyptians were threatened by them because of their numbers, and so they enslaved them. And they wanted to kind of keep them down and keep them under their heel. And for 400 years, they're slaves, and they're crying out to God for deliverance. And so God finally, in due time, raises up a man named Moses to be their deliverer, who God's going to use to bring them out of Egyptian bondage and slavery. So let's start reading here, Exodus chapter 2. Let me just read the first couple of verses, and we'll walk our way through. Verse 1 says, "Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she came pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months." So we see from the tribe of Levi. So basically, it's clear that Moses had Levi's. But anyway, we're not going to kind of get into that stupid joke. You want to call it a joke. Anyway, he was a fine child. Now, every parent considers their child to be a fine child. I don't know if you've ever seen a newborn baby and the parents are just so proud, and most of the time they're cute, but how many know not always, the kids aren't always cute. I've a couple of times gone to see, brand new babies. Oh, they're just so cute. And they pull the blanket back. I'm like, ooh, okay, wow, yeah, beautiful. Sometimes they got that prune face, and, the birth situation was challenging for the baby or whatever. And so every parent thinks their child's a fine child. But when this verse is talking about Moses in this way, this reference is to Moses. When they realized he was a fine child, what they're describing is something distinct about Moses. They realized immediately that God's hand was upon him. There was something unique, something different that God wanted to do through this little baby's life. Now, as we mentioned last week, because the Egyptians were so threatened by the huge numbers of Israelites within their borders, they decided that they were going to institute a policy of infanticide. So any Jewish baby boys who were born, they were going to kill them. And that's how they wanted to kind of keep things under control and keep the population down. And so, of course, a baby little Moses was threatened in that environment. Pick up verse 3. So she has this baby. He should have been killed based on the Egyptian law. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh, "Shall I go to get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother, got Moses' mother, to do the nursing. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman, Moses' mom, took the baby and nursed him. And when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." So the name Moses literally means that. It means to draw out. So what we see here in verse 10 also is that there came a point after Moses' mom actually had an opportunity to nurse her own baby, though it was going to be adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, that she at some point was going to have to give up her baby because of this adoption, and it was beyond, it was time for the baby to be weaned. I don't know if you can imagine, any of you mothers, how hard that must have been for her to have that bonding moment, those intimate first few months or years, and then have to give that child up to another family. But think about it, in their situation, the alternative was far worse. The alternative would have been that they would have killed her baby. And so at least she knew that her baby was going to be able to have a life, and actually have a pretty amazing life in the household of Pharaoh. And it's just so awesome to me as I read this story to just see the mercy of God in it. Because think about this, not only did God have a plan to rescue Moses, and God had a plan to use his life in a great way, God even saw to the small detail of giving Moses' own mom the opportunity to have those moments with her baby boy and to nurse him. I mean, just out of God's love and God's compassion, and not only do those things, but actually get paid to do it. I mean, that's a pretty awesome deal. So this just again illustrates God's sovereign hand at work in history. He is in absolute control of everything, and absolutely nothing catches him by surprise. He's working things according to his will. Now, Moses' life can be divided into 3 40-year segments. The first 40-year segment is going to be from his birth up until he's 40 years old, as he's a member of Pharaoh's household. He's been adopted into Pharaoh's family. So he's growing up in the palace as an adopted son. And in this position, there was incredible privilege, tremendous opportunity, wonderful blessing in his life. I mean, he was like the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, man. He lived in Bel-Air. He shopped on Rodeo Drive. He drove Dad's BMW to school every day. You know what I'm saying? I mean, he just had everything at his fingertips because Pharaoh was the leader of the mightiest nation on the planet at that time. And it's interesting that in Stephen's sermon recorded in the book of Acts, chapter 7, he actually gives us a little specific insight into these historical events with Moses. In Acts 7:22, I think it's in your notes there, it says, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So basically, he was involved in the best educational system on the planet at that time, especially in the area of science and math. So this was his experience in the first 40 years of his life. But then we see the second 40-year segment beginning in verse 11. It says, one day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that, basically looking around, seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting, and he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed that Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." And when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Again, Stephen's going to give us a little more insight into these historical events in Acts chapter 7, verses 23 through 29. It says, but when he was approaching the age of 40, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, the sons of Israel. And when he saw one of them being treated unjustly, he defended him, took vengeance for the oppressed by striking down the Egyptian. And he supposed, this is important, he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. On the following day, he appeared to them as they were fighting together, and he tried to reconcile them in peace, saying, "Men, you are brethren, why are you injuring each other?" But the one who was injuring his neighbor pushed him away, saying, "Who made you a ruler or judge over us? You do not mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian yesterday, do you?" And at this remark, Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of two sons. So the key there is verse 25, where Moses, when he killed that Egyptian to defend one of his own people, he assumed that they would understand that he was actually there to serve as God's deliverer. Of course, the scripture makes it plain that they did not understand that at all at that time. But what this shows us is that Moses evidently knew his calling at this point in his life. He knew that this was a part of his purpose, that God wanted to use them in this way to help his people and deliver his people. So it's interesting. He knew what God's will was for his life, but he clearly didn't understand the when as it related to God's will. So he knew God's will, but he 100% missed God's timing. So of course he realizes, hey man, these guys aren't accepting me as anything. They saw me kill that Egyptian. They're certainly sounds like they're going to rat me out. I need to get out of Dodge here because the Pharaoh's going to come after me. So he had to run to the wilderness. And he spent 40 years. So his second 40-year segment of his life was in exile in the wilderness. Now I've heard preachers and teachers over the years talk about this experience in Moses' life, saying, well, this was God's purpose and this was God's plan, and God had to use the wilderness to prepare Moses. But, I'm not exactly sure about that. I don't believe it had to be that way. If Moses had recognized that he had been called to be a deliverer and waited to do it in God's way and in God's time, he didn't have to spend 40 years in the wilderness to learn this lesson the hard way. I believe it would have been a whole lot different for him had he been in Pharaoh's household. Who knew what possibilities could have arisen for him to still be the deliverer of God's people, to be in a position of great influence, and to facilitate what God wanted to do for God's own people. But see, the problem was that Moses didn't recognize God's timing. And guys, when it comes to God's will, God's timing is critically important. And this is where really all of us struggle from time to time. We really want to know what the will of God is. And then when we feel like we know what the will of God is, sometimes we're not sensitive to the timing of God in that. But we can see, like Jesus was a great example of understanding both. Jesus knew his Father's will, but he always trusted the Father's timing. In John 7, his brothers were challenging him. And he said, guys, listen, my time has not yet come. He's attending a wedding. They run out of wine. His mother starts pressuring him, and he tells her, listen, my hour, my time has not yet come. He understood that there was a timing to the will of God in his life. Then, of course, we have the example of Lazarus recorded in John 11, where he's good friends with Mary and Martha and Lazarus. He receives word, Jesus receives word that Lazarus is terminally ill, but he intentionally does not go immediately. They sent for Jesus because they believed he was the Messiah. They believed he had the power to heal Lazarus. But Jesus intentionally didn't go. He delayed and arrived 4 days late on purpose. And Mary and Martha were not happy with this. They were frustrated. In fact, each of the two sisters individually, basically snidely said to Jesus, you know what, Lord, had you been here, Lazarus would still be alive. It's almost like this backhanded snide. I can just see it with a little bit of attitude, a little bit of hand on the hip, a little bit of sarcasm there, sassy, salty, that they were unhappy that Jesus didn't come when they let him know what was going on with Lazarus. And what's interesting is Jesus responded to them really with a bit of frustration, with this heavy sigh, and he went ahead and did what the Father had in mind, which was calling Lazarus out of that tomb. But here's what we need to understand. Jesus did what he did. He delayed on purpose, not because he didn't love Lazarus, but he did it for a greater glory. In fact, in John 11, verse 5, it specifically says Jesus loved Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, but when they called for him, he delayed on purpose. Now, I don't know if you've ever found yourself in God's waiting room. It's like, God, why aren't things moving? Why aren't things happening? And the first assumption is, God, you must not love me. You must not really care about what I'm dealing with. But you know what? Maybe God's delays are for a greater glory. Maybe God has something in mind for a higher purpose that he wants to do in your life or someone else's life or the situation surrounding what you're going through. But see, Jesus understood that with the Father's will, you have an equally important issue, which is the Father's timing for how he wants to do things and when he wants to do things. So Moses clearly didn't understand that. He knew God's will, didn't understand God's timing, and just took matters into his own hands. And guys, this is where most of us struggle. So real quickly, let me give you some quick principles here from this story, how to learn to be sensitive to God's will and God's timing in our lives. So if you're taking notes, write these down real quick. Here's the first one. If you want to stay in God's will and in God's timing, look up instead of around. Look up instead of around. Chapter 2, verse 12 says that Moses didn't ask God about what to do when he saw this Egyptian, abusing one of his people. But what did he do? He looked around. He didn't look to God, but he looked around. He took matters into his hands, and he acted impulsively. And we tend to do the same thing. We tend to look around at the situation. We tend to feel the pressure. Hey, something's got to be done. Action needs to be taken. And all too often, we act impulsively and we get ahead of God because we feel that pressure, that we feel like we have to act now. It might be with a career issue, a career move. It might be a relationship issue. It might be a question about whether to marry someone. It could be a major purchase. It could be pretty much anything. But the principle here is to stay in the will and the timing of God is to look to God. Look to him first. We shared this verse a couple weeks ago, Psalm 37, verse 4. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. How many of you believe that? Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So really what that verse is saying is that when you focus on him, take delight in God and his purpose for your life, he will birth his desires. He will give you those desires in your heart that are his desires for you. But you got to stay focused on him. You have to stay focused on his clearly revealed will in the Bible. And when you stay focused on his clearly revealed will, he will lead you in those things that aren't clearly stated in the Bible, and you can stay in alignment both with his will and his timing. Let's not look around. It's great to get advice. It's great to get input. Of course, we use our brains and we analyze situations, but we always want to take it to God. We always want to look to him. Here's the second thing. If we're going to stay in the will and the timing of God, there really shouldn't be any guilt involved in our actions. And we see this was a byproduct of what Moses did. Verse 12, Moses is guilty, feels guilty about what he did, so he takes the dead body of that Egyptian and he buries it to cover his tracks. Can I tell you that when something's right, when the timing is right, you won't need to hide it. You won't need to be sneaky. You won't have to, kind of do it in secret. You won't be experiencing guilt about it if it's really God's will and it's in alignment with God's timing. Remember Adam and Eve? They disobeyed, they ate the fruit, and what did they do in response to their disobedience? They felt guilty and they were hiding, as though they really could have successfully hidden from God. But that's what guilt does. And it was an expression of the fact that they were out of the will of God. So guilt, hiding, secrecy, all these things are a clue. Hey, this may not be God's will, or this may not be God's timing. John 18, verse 20 says, this was Jesus' way of living his life. Jesus answered him, I've spoken openly to the world. I've always taught in the synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. So listen, guys, if you have to look over your shoulder, then it may not be God's will. And it very likely is not God's timing. Guilt should not be involved. Thirdly, there should be no striving. When something is in the will of God and the timing of God, there's no striving. What is striving? Striving is this emotional feeling, this need that I have to do something. And I need to make this thing happen. My dad used to describe it as trying to push a rope, right? That futile effort to try to make something happen, and you're never really going to be able to make it happen properly. And this is exactly what Moses was doing in the story. He was taking matters into his own hands. I mean, did he really think he was going to be the deliverer of Israel by killing one Egyptian at a time? Taking out one Egyptian bully at a time? Was this really going to be God's plan for his life? What was he thinking? No, he acted impulsively. This was not what God had in mind. So this striving, this pressure to act, this inner feeling and this pressure to make something happen is an evidence that we're stepping out of the will of God and out of the timing of God. So when we're in God's will and timing, there isn't going to be striving. Now, it may not be easy. All right, doing the will of God and being in God's timing will often mean that we're going to deal with some challenges. That's not what we're talking about. But it's the striving part that really should be absent. You remember, after Moses appears before Pharaoh and all the plagues of Egypt, Pharaoh finally says, all right, go. And they leave, and all of a sudden, they get backed up against the Red Sea. And Egypt's armies are pursuing them, and it has them backed in the corner. It's interesting that Moses reacted differently at that point. Notice, this is after his second 40-year segment of his life in the wilderness, where he learned these lessons that we're talking about the hard way. So when he was in that crisis moment, notice there was no striving. There was no fear. There was no guilt. There was none of those things. He wasn't trying to make things happen. There was no battle, no fighting, no stressing, this urge to do something. He appealed to God. God spoke to him and said, you know what? Hold out your staff, Moses. And God parted the Red Sea. God held off the armies. They crossed over on dry ground, and when the enemies pursued them, God took care of the enemies. So it's interesting that Moses learned that lesson of rather than striving, that it's way better to just be trusting God to work according to his will and according to his timing. I've had people tell me, man, Pastor Dave, I've been dating this person and I really love them. I really feel like they're the person that I'm supposed to marry, but they're not interested. I feel like I just need to make this thing happen. I need to find a way to make them like me. What can I do to get them to like me? Guys, that's pushing a rope. That's striving. That's trying to just take it and make it happen. Now listen, God's will often require work and effort. Have you learned that? That God's will is not always easy. So there will be work, there will be effort, it will be difficult. It's not passive to be in the will and the timing of God. But there's a difference between working out God's will and striving to make it happen in your own energy and in your own efforts. So we need to just trust God and not strive and wait on his will to be revealed and his timing to be fulfilled. The last thing, there should be no fear. When Moses realized he was not accepted as the deliverer, when his people didn't really get it, he became very afraid. He realized it was probably going to get found out, and one of them would probably report him. So when it comes to the will of God, one of the best evidences to the will of God in your life is the peace of God. That sense of absolute peace, a knowing in your heart. Now, this is an intangible, subjective thing. It's very hard to describe. It's something that as you walk with the Lord, you will learn to fine-tune this. But I've heard experienced believers, mature Christians throughout my lifetime talk about how they listen to the peace of God in their life when it comes to major decisions. And there are times that they experience what they describe as a check in their heart. Like God's saying, no, this is not what I want for you. Even in situations where all the surrounding circumstances look like this is the perfect deal. But they're sensitive in their heart that hey, I just don't have peace about this. And this is so critically important because peace is the seal of God's will in our lives. Again, I'm not saying that the will of God is going to be easy. There will be challenges, there will be difficulties. But when you're in the will and the timing of God, even as you're wrestling all the alligators, you will have a sense of absolute peace knowing that God is with you. And you need that. I need that. We need to know in the middle of the battles that we're fighting that we're not out there on our own trying to make it happen, but we're walking right alongside the Lord and his will, and we're walking in the footsteps that he's laid out for us. Colossians 3:15 says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Remember, Moses, after his wilderness experience, rather than being fearful, he then had the ability to stand right in front of Moses, Moses stood in front of Pharaoh in Pharaoh's court, pointed his finger at the most powerful man on the planet, and said, let my people go. No fear. Absolute confidence. Where did that come from? It came from the peace of God, knowing he was in the will of God and in the timing of God and in the plan of God for his life. And he wants every single one of our lives to have that same hallmark. So whenever we're making a decision, big or small, never go against your peace. If you just feel troubled, if you don't have peace, and as you're praying about it and you're in the Word and you're walking with God, and everything might look right on the outside, it's just like, man, I just don't feel this is what I need to do. Listen to that. Can I just tell you, and some of you can probably testify, every time I've violated that peace in my heart, I have regretted it. Every time. I can look back and say, man, I knew better. Because I didn't have peace, and someone influenced me, or someone pushed me, or I just gave in to my own urge to get this thing done, whatever it was. But I knew in my heart there wasn't peace there. So we need to listen to that. Trust God. His Holy Spirit will lead us in that way. He says, let the peace of Christ rule. Let him rule in your life. So this story, this segment of the story, is a great lesson for all of us as it relates to the will of God. Moses did not have to spend 40 years in the wilderness. God used it. He causes all things to work together for good. But there is an alternative to learn all those lessons in life the hard way. And he wants to mature us and grow us. Amen, everybody? Let's pray. Would you bow your heads with me?